Important part of inventory transactions and sometimes can be a little confusing. So let's go through them and make sure hopefully that you're understanding them correctly. When you purchase inventory, you'll have shipping terms associated with your purchase or your invoice. There are two types. You can have FOB shipping and FOB destination. The FOB part for each of these stands for free on board. Free on board for the at shipping point. A lot of times it's not just FOB shipping, it's FOB shipping point. And then FOB destination, free on board destination. FOB and the same, is either way still stands for the same thing. On board, the easiest way for me to explain it is to always think in terms of the purchaser or the buyer of the products. And so that's whose eyes we're going to look through. So in that case, the FOB refers to the buyer. It's free on board to the buyer until, and that's where we're going to fill in the blank with each of these. All right, so let's start with FOB shipping point. So FOB shipping point is free on board to the buyer until it reaches the shipping point. And with all of these shipping, with both of these shipping terms, there are two important things. One, who's responsible for paying the shipping charges? And two is, when does title pass for ownership of the goods? Okay? If it's FOB shipping point, it's free on board to the buyer until it reaches the shipping point. Well, the shipping point is where it's leaving. So, for instance, if you're in Atlanta and you purchase items from a company in New York, New York is the shipping point, and Atlanta is the destination. So if it's free on board to the buyer until it reaches the shipping point, that means it's free to the buyer until it reaches the place it's going to leave in New York. So if it's going to go anywhere, who's the responsible party who's going to have to pay for it? It's going to be the buyer. The buyer is responsible for FOB shipping point. Okay, otherwise it's not going to move. It's not going to leave. Nobody's going to put it on a truck and deliver it to Atlanta. So it's free to the buyer until it reaches the shipping point. At that point, they're going to have to pay, or they're responsible for paying. The seller, as a courtesy, can pay for the shipping, but if they pay for the shipping, they're going to want that back from the buyer because it was not the seller's responsibility. It was the buyer's responsibility. So they're going to include that in that receivable that's due from the buyer. It's going to be something that they have to pay back. Again, for the seller, it's just an increase in receivables. It's not an expense for the seller because it's not the seller's responsibility. For the buyer, that's going to be a part of the inventory cost. Okay? Shipping would always be a part of inventory costs for the buyer. This also tells us when title passes. Same thing. FOB shipping point. The buyer is responsible for shipping. That also means that the title and the ownership changes hands or passes over at the shipping point. So as soon as it gets on the truck to leave New York to come to Atlanta, the buyer now owns those goods. So the buyer needs to make sure that they've recorded them in the correct period as well, because that's when title transfers. That's when they own it, actually. FOB destination means that it's free on board to the buyer until it reaches the destination. Okay, again, in our example, Atlanta is the destination. So it's free on board to the buyer till it reaches Atlanta. So who's going to have to pay for it? Well, it's still free to the buyer until it gets to Atlanta. Well, the shipping company is going to want some payment for this. So that means this is when the seller is responsible for it. All right, so that's an expense for the seller now. It's part of their, issue, not problem, but it's their responsibility. So the buyer is not responsible for shipping in this point. This also means that the title does not transfer, ownership does not transfer until it reaches the destination. So the buyer doesn't technically own this until it gets to Atlanta. Once it gets there, then title transfers. Okay, so there's, again, two important things when we talk about shipping terms. Who's responsible for paying it, and then when does title pass as well.